Hello, and welcome to the third annual Analytic Theology Lecture. I'm Michael Ray. I'm the director of the Center for Philosophy of Religion at the University of Notre Dame. This Analytic Theology Lecture series at AAR has been sponsored in its first 3 years by the Analytic Theology Project, funded by the John Templeton Foundation in partnership with the Center for Philosophy of Religion. Today's lecture will be followed by a reception in the Homeland Room, which is just down the hall, conveniently, and that's going to be immediately following the Q&A. Our lecturer today is Marilyn McCord Adams. Marilyn was one of my teachers when I was an undergraduate at UCLA, so it's a special privilege to be able to introduce her here this afternoon. Marilyn has earned doctorates in philosophy and divinity from Cornell University and Oxford University, respectively. She's published extensively in both philosophy and theology, and she's held a variety of prestigious positions in both fields. If there were a Platonic form of analytic theologian, no doubt she would greatly resemble Marilyn. Just this year, Marilyn was appointed as Distinguished Research Professor at Rutgers University. She's held faculty positions in philosophy at the University of Michigan, UCLA, and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She served on faculty at the Divinity School and the Department of Religious Studies at Yale University, and she was Regius Professor of Divinity at Oxford University. Several of these positions were endowed professorships. She's given a variety of named lectures, including the Gifford Lectures in 1999, and her many publications have ranged over all manner of topics: metaphysics, philosophy of language, moral theory, and the like, primarily in medieval philosophy and philosophical theology. Among these works are several influential books, including her magisterial 2-volume treatise, William of Ockham, Horrendous Evils and the Goodness of God, and Christ and Horrors, as well as numerously widely read and highly influential articles. In addition to these scholarly works, she has also published a book of prayers entitled Opening to God, Childlike Prayers for Adults, and a book of sermons, Wrestling for Blessing. Her lecture today is entitled, What's Wrong with the Ontotheological Fallacy? Please welcome Marilyn McCord Adams.
Thank you, Michael. In some circles, the ontotheological error is a buzzword, a dismissive pejorative hurled at philosophical theologians who say that God falls under the concept of being. The accusation is that to say that God falls under the concept being is to imply that God is a being alongside others. Whatever good-making features may otherwise be ascribed, God is thereby brought down to the level of creatures. Perfect being theology makes God differ from creatures only in degree and not in kind. To believers in such a God, critics of ontotheology charge, your God is too small. My questions are, what and why? What exactly is the ontotheological error? And why is it an error? The label makes it clear. Ontotheology is a species of philosophical theology. My second question, therefore, breaks into two. What philosophical mistakes is ontotheology thought to make? And why are these taken to be theologically disastrous? Ineffability versus personality. In a way, this controversy goes back to the earliest days of Christian philosophical theology, and may be epitomized in the contrast between Plotinus and Augustine. Recall the ultimate explainer in Plotinus' philosophy is the one, which is absolutely simple. Plotinus presupposes a semantics according to which predications of the form S is P posit a composition between the subject of the property and the property. Metaphysically, predications posit a potency-act distinction. The subject is in potency to receiving the property which actualizes it. Plotinus concludes that where positive properties are concerned, the one is ineffable. It cannot even be said that the one exists. Moreover, knowledge implies a distinction between cognitive subject and cognitive object. So the one is not a knower, and hence not a willer. Rather, the one necessarily emanates the next hypostasis, intelligence, which is a composite of receiver and what is received. And one through intelligence necessarily emanates soul, and one through intelligence and soul necessarily emanates the material world. Matter at the bottom is non-being, where the great chain of being runs out. Plotinus maintains that the ultimate explainer itself stands in no need of explanation, but explains the existence of anything and everything else as its productive cause. The one also explains the existence of everything else in its role as final cause. Everything other than the one has a built-in tendency to return to the one, so that the whole cosmos executes a kind of exodus redditus dynamic. Overall, Plotinus' philosophy posits the ultimate explainer as wholly other, not a being, but beyond being, the ineffable source of all else. In an understandable sense, Plotinus' God is about as big a God as you can get. No danger here of mistaking the creature for the creator. Certainly, Plotinus' philosophy is religious. What devotees are to aim for is a kind of mystical reunion with the source of all being. Certainly, Augustine read and was influenced by Plotinus and other Platonizing philosophers. They, along with Cicero and hand-me-down Aristotle, were his introduction to philosophy. Augustine tells us that the Platonic distinction between the material and immaterial and its conception of evil as a privation of being were key to finding his way out of Manichaeism. Certainly, Plotinus' portrait of the one as totally other and ineffable satisfies the theological desideratum of avoiding idolatry, of not confusing the creature with the creator. Nevertheless, the project of formulating Christian philosophical theology calls attention to other theological desiderata, other phenomena to be saved. The texts of the Bible represent God as personal, as an intelligent voluntary agent who interacts directly and through patriarchs and prophets with merely human persons who get drafted into forwarding divine purposes in the world, human persons whose desires God hopes to shape through divine presence and divine commands. Biblical texts introduce us to God who is without peers, but they do not present God as utterly ineffable. Much of human religious traffic in prayer and worship is with a personal God who is presumed to have thoughts and to make choices. Thus, biblical religion confronts the theologian with the problem: which factor to weigh more heavily, texts and practice that insist that God is personal, or the demand to avoid idolatry? Perhaps encouraged by Middle Platonists, Augustine tries to have it both ways. Augustine begins with the Platonizing philosophical framework and attempts to integrate it with the personalizing desiderata of Christian theology. Roughly speaking, Augustine's Platonism collapses Plotinus' one with intelligence, the first emanated hypostasis. Augustine's God is simple, but not utterly ineffable. Augustine's God is the source of everything other than God's self, yet God is not beyond being. God is being itself. Augustine agrees that by definition, the ultimate explainer cannot have and does not need any external explanation. But pace Plotinus, Augustine does not conclude that the ultimate explainer needs no explanation, but rather that being itself is self-explanatory. Moreover, Augustine's God is a knower, like Plotinus' intelligence, thought thinking a plurality of divine ideas, and, unlike Plotinus' one or intelligence, a willer. Having concluded that divine agency is intelligent voluntary agency, Augustine denies that God produces everything other than God's self by necessary emanation, but rather by free choice of will. So is Augustine guilty of ontotheology? True, Augustine denies that God is beyond being, but it doesn't follow that Augustine sees God as a being alongside others. As much as Plotinus, Augustine insists that the ultimate explainer has to be distinctive, necessarily without rivals. Nothing else is or could be such that its being and excellence are self-explanatory. Nothing else is or could be the ultimate explainer of the being and excellence of everything else. True, Augustine and Plotinus have a philosophical disagreement about the nature of explanation, about whether the ultimate explainer has to be beyond being and beyond explanation, or whether it explains F-ness here below by being self-explanatory with respect to F-ness. But why should this be theologically disastrous? True, Augustine's strategy may sound like it makes God a little less other. Both God and creatures are explananda. But by styling God as self-explanatory F-ness, Augustine finds a way to fit God's role as ultimate explainer with a conception of God as personal. Self-explanatory wisdom is not beyond wisdom. Self-explanatory wisdom is wisdom. God is all-wise, just as the Bible tells us, just as devotees confess, just as one would expect paradigm personality to be. Augustine claims that divine agency is intelligent voluntary agency, affirms that God is just and wise, merciful and kind. Does Augustine, by personifying God, thereby make God too small? Augustine's bold answer is no. In effect, he proposes a thought experiment. Think your way into Plotinus' system. However big you think the ultimate explainer is for Plotinus, tumble to the realization that that bigness is personal. Augustine's reintegration of Platonizing philosophical frameworks identifies transcendent goodness with being itself and insists that personality, intelligent voluntary agency, is the heart of reality. God is paradigm intelligent voluntary agency. Angels and humans participate in it, are made in God's image as less excellent copies. Now, one might protest that this thought experiment leads to philosophical incoherence. What is simple cannot be paradigm wisdom and paradigm justice, cannot be literally just or wise. This reaction is understandable enough, but let's look more carefully at what it is fair to demand. Augustine isn't saying that we can take Plotinus as is and just add on the notion that the ultimate explainer is personal. He is launching a research program. Start with Plotinus. Save as much as possible, while at the same time insisting that the heart of reality is personal. This demands a reintegration of philosophical and theological desiderata. Augustine himself made significant advances, but the effort to reach theoretical coherence kept philosophical theologians busy through the patristic period and the Latin Middle Ages into Reformed scholasticism for over 1,000 years. Like Cartesians with colors, apophatic theology has to explain divine personality away, as at best ontologically superficial, and at worst a manner of speaking, a concession to the way unsophisticated human persons engage religious encounters. Starting from Christian belief and practice, that's a significant cost. This is one reason why Augustinian Platonism and scholastic Aristotelianism try for metaphysically distinctive intelligent voluntary agency, a self-explanatory explainer of the being and excellence of everything else. Participation versus univocity, or Aquinas versus Scotus. Now, both Aquinas and Scotus fell heir to the problem of how to preserve divine personality, intelligent voluntary agency in the Godhead, while avoiding idolatry. Recently, however, members of the radical Orthodox school have insisted that Scotus is guilty of the ontotheological error, while Aquinas is not. Unfortunately, the evidently learned leaders of this movement, and they really are learned, handle historical texts and rival conceptualities in such a way that it is difficult to know precisely what they mean. Certainly one charge is that Scotus rejects Aquinas' metaphysics of participation. Aquinas on paradigm and participation. Where the metaphysics of participation is concerned, radical orthodoxy understands Aquinas to be forwarding three important theses. First, God is ipsum esse and is all perfection per se. Second, creatures, both with respect to their natures and with respect to their existence, are participations of the divine. The metaphysical constitution of creatable natures, their whatness, is grounded in the actuality of the divine essence, insofar as each creatable nature is, at metaphysical bottom, a way of imperfectly resembling the divine. Cow nature, my favorite, imperfectly imitates the divine essence cow-wise, horse nature horse-wise, and so forth. Moreover, Aquinas maintains that God, as ipsum esse, is boundless actuality, while creatures are analyzable into a receiving subject and the actuality received. Aquinas speaks of creatable natures as if they were subjects in potency to receive actuality. But what is received after the manner of the receiver. So when God gives creatable natures the gift of actual existence, esse, they contract it. Cow nature contracts esse into esse bovum, being a cow. Horse nature to esse equum, being a horse. Individuators further contract being a cow into Beulah rather than Elsie, being a horse into Hi-Ho Silver rather than Streaker. In general, participated esse is limited to being of some natural kind, while ipsum esse is boundless. Third, Aquinas holds that the metaphysics analyzes the structures of ens commune, being in general, which he identifies with created being qua being. God, or ipsum esse, is not included in the subject matter of metaphysics, except incidentally, insofar as metaphysics spawns cosmological arguments for the existence of God as the source of all else. Thus, on radical orthodoxies read, Aquinas' God as paradigm transcends creatures. God is not one being among others, all of which are subject to metaphysical analysis. Metaphysics is about creatures that participate in Godhead, creatures that owe what they are and that they are to what God actually is. Scotus on univocity and ontotheology. Radical orthodoxy charges Scotus with unraveling this synthesis. Following Avicenna, Scotus not only holds that the proper subject matter of metaphysics is being qua being, he goes on to maintain that there is a univocal concept of being that applies equally to God and creatures. Radical orthodoxy protests that these moves subordinate God to being in general and make God a subject to metaphysical analysis as one being among others. Not only does Scotus thereby commit the ontotheological error, he also wrecks Aquinas' metaphysics of participation. Whereas Aquinas joins Aristotle in insisting that actuality is prior to possibility, by insisting that the constitution of creatable natures is grounded in the actuality of the divine essence, Scotus rejects this and falls into the trap of treating possibility as prior to actuality. Moreover, Scotus refuses Aquinas' picture of creatable essences as potency receiving actuality, or esse, as a gift. Well, certainly, Scotus and Aquinas have their philosophical differences. So far as the subject matter of metaphysics is concerned, both are party to a long-standing dispute within Aristotelian philosophy of science. For Aristotle, a science is a system of propositions held together by the unity of its subject matter. Such unity presupposes some general concept under which everything treated by that science falls. Aristotelian sciences aimed to be something like Euclidean geometry, proceeding from real definitions and first principles by syllogistic deductive inferences to further conclusions. Not only are the propositions within a given science organized by entailment relations as premises and conclusions, the sciences themselves form a hierarchy, where the existence of a subject matter it needs proving. Aristotle declares no science proves the existence of its own subject matter. For example, physics does not prove the metaphysical possibility of motion, but takes over that conclusion from a higher science. For example, music takes from mathematics the existence of proportions involved in harmonic intervals. Now, where the subject matter of metaphysics is concerned, two problems arise. First, Aristotle equivocates between generality and excellence as the criterion for ranking a science higher or lower. Logically, it would seem that the subject matter of the higher science should be more abstract and so include within its scope everything that falls under the lower sciences. Reasoning this way, Aristotle concludes that since metaphysics is the highest science, its subject matter should be being qua being. On the other hand, Aristotle's ontology includes beings, the separate intelligences that are not studied by the science of physics. Since they are more excellent than corporeal things, there must be some higher science, what could it be if not metaphysics, that studies them. So is metaphysics properly the study of the structures of being precisely insofar as it is being, or is metaphysics theology? Both Scotus and Aquinas agree with Avicenna against Averroes. The proper object of metaphysics is not theology, but being qua being. Both Scotus and Aquinas join Avicenna in using the principles of metaphysics to mount cosmological arguments for the existence of God as the self-explanatory source of the being, excellence, and activity of everything else. Both concur that metaphysics should examine what beings have in common, what the principal structures and categories of being qua being are, and investigate what the ultimate cause of being is. Where Scotus and Aquinas differ is about whether God falls under the abstract general concept that unifies the science of metaphysics, or whether God hovers at the margin of the domain of things that fall under that concept and gets covered by metaphysics only insofar as Godhead is the cause of all else. Aquinas takes the latter option. He identifies the subject of metaphysics as ens commune, which he restricts to created being. Following Avicenna, Scotus makes the opposite choice, the better to secure the comprehensive scope of metaphysics. Either way, we should not overread the theological consequences. Aquinas himself distinguishes the logical participation of something in a general concept under which it falls from the metaphysical participation of a subject in some actuality it receives. That something falls under an abstract concept by itself implies nothing about the thing's metaphysical structure or independence. A second and logically independent problem for Aristotelian philosophy of science is whether the abstract concept that identifies the unifying subject matter of metaphysics applies to the things studied by that science univocally or only analogically. If the concept of being were like genus concepts in applying univocally to whatever fell under them, the way animal is univocally predicated of Socrates and Beulah the cow, wouldn't that mean that being is a genus? But if being were a genus, then it would have to be divided by differentia that come from outside the genus, the way the differentia rational is not included in but adds something to the genus animal. But what falls outside of being is nothing. So ancient Aristotle commentators reasoned that because Aristotle's categories are the highest genera, beings in one category would have neither genera nor differentia in common with beings in another category. They understood Aristotle to conclude that the concept of being cannot be univocally, but at most analogically predicated of substance and accidents. Aquinas followed this position, insisting that pure perfection terms and being apply analogically, not only to items in different categories, but to God and creatures. For his part, Scotus returns to the notion that Aristotelian science is a system of propositions organized into sound deductive syllogisms. A syllogism, all A's are B's, all B's are C's, therefore all A's are C's, can be valid only if the middle term, B, is taken univocally in both premises. Otherwise, there's a fallacy of four terms. Scotus concludes that metaphysics can furnish sound cosmological arguments from finite beings to infinite being only if there is some concept of being that applies univocally to God and creatures. As Richard Cross points out, this is, for Scotus, a semantic thesis. As Steve Dumont emphasizes, Scotus's concept of univocity is very thin, requiring only as much sameness of meaning as it would take to avoid the fallacy of four terms. Aquinas advances cosmological arguments using metaphysical principles. How, Cross asks, could Aquinas deny that the concept of being, deployed in them, is univocal in Scotus' sense? In insisting on a univocal concept of being that applies across the categories and to God as well as creatures, Scotus separates the issue of whether there is an abstract concept that applies to X and Y from the ontological questions of whether X and Y have any common metaphysical constituents, say of whether X and Y share a genus or a differentia. Not only would Scotus agree with Aquinas and Aristotle that the substance nature cow and the quality whiteness share neither genus nor differentia, Scotus insists that wisdom is univocally predicated of divine and created wisdom, just as human being is univocally predicated of Socrates and Plato, but that it doesn't follow that there is any common nature wisdom that exists in God and Socrates, the way there is a common human nature that exists in both Socrates and Plato. Univocal as opposed to analogical concepts do not jeopardize divine otherness. We have only to review Scotus's cosmological arguments to discover how the univocal concept of being does not stand in the way of his concluding that God is simple, externally unproducible, and independently productive, necessarily extant, immutable, eternal, and so forth. Once we see how Scotus separates the issue of common concept from that of common metaphysical constituent, we can appreciate how the disagreement between Aquinas and Scotus is semantic and or cognitive psychological. Whichever side we take in this philosophical dispute, insinuations of imminent theological disaster seem overwrought. According to radical orthodoxy, modality is another area of dangerous disagreement between Aquinas and Scotus. For Aquinas, actuality is prior to possibility, while for Scotus, it's the other way around. In the language of contemporary analytic philosophy, Aquinas is an actualist, while Scotus is a possibilist. Their reference is to Aquinas' claim that the possibility of creatable natures is grounded on the actuality of the divine essence, insofar as creatable natures are at bottom ways of imperfectly imitating the divine essence. Insofar as participation includes imperfect resemblance, the very constitution of creatable natures is to be a way of participating in the divine essence. Scotus agrees that all creatable natures imperfectly resemble the divine essence, but Scotus denies that creatable natures are constituted by imitability relations for the philosophical reason that relations are metaphysically and epistemologically posterior to their relata. Therefore, the imperfect resemblance relation presupposes both relata, not only the divine essence, but also the creatable nature, and so cannot be what, at metaphysical bottom, constitutes the creatable nature. For Aristotelians, there are further philosophical problems with Aquinas' suggestion. For example, his theory would make all creatable natures at bottom relatives. This might capture well the metaphysical flimsiness that the original Plato ascribes to items in the spatio-temporal world of our experience, but it fits badly with the Aristotelian categories which Aquinas deploys in his metaphysical analysis of things here below. Substance, quantity, and quality are not relatives. Of course, someone could say that Aristotle's categories and imitability relations belong to different levels of analysis of what a creatable nature is, but that would make Aristotle's categories superficial and imitability relations fundamental. The superficiality of Aristotelian categories is something at which Aquinas never hints. For his own part, Scotus follows Avicenna in maintaining that the constitution of creatable natures pertains to them of themselves. Likewise, the non-repugnance of their constitutive formal principles pertains to them of themselves. That rational animality constitutes human nature is thus not grounded in anything else. To achieve philosophical coherence, Scotus does pay the price of denying that the whatness of creatable natures depends on the divine essence. Nevertheless, radical orthodoxy ignores Scotus's insistence that creatable natures depend on God for any being they have. God's actually thinking them produces them an intelligible being, indeed impossible being. They depend on the divine essence principia tibi as their source. Likewise, God's actually willing them produces them an esse existentiae, an actual existence. That human nature is intelligible and possible, all the more actually extant, does depend on the actual existence, thought, and will of God. Scotus also rejects the other thesis of Aquinas' participation metaphysics that analyzes creatures into a receiving subject, the creatable essence or individuated essence, and the actuality received, the actual existence or esse. What spoils this idea for Scotus is his counterexample that receiving subjects are naturally prior to what they perceive, his counterprinciple that receiving subjects are naturally prior to what they receive. This is because causes of all four Aristotelian types, including the material cause, are, and are what they are, naturally prior to what is caused. Scotus distinguishes between subjective potency and objective potency. Pale Socrates and subjective potency to becoming tan. There already exists something that is the subject, and it has a passive potency to receive tan color. But dodos are only an objective potency, insofar as their constitutive principles, genus and differentia, are formally compossible. Aquinas' picture treats creatable natures as being in subjective potency with respect to esse. But Scotus insists that while there are as yet no cows, bovine nature is not actually something that has a passive potency to receive esse the way pale Socrates is actually something with a passive potency to receive tan color. It makes no difference whether the priority in question is temporal or natural, nor will it help to say that while there are as yet no cows, bovine nature is actually something, namely a way of imitating the divine essence, for Aristotelian metaphysics does not treat relations as subjects of potencies for further actualization. Nevertheless, no theological disaster follows if there is no prior subject to receive esse as a gift. What is amazing for Scotus is that God freely and gratuitously wills the existence of creatures, whatever their metaphysical constitution may be. Overall, then, Scotus departs from Aquinas' philosophical picture, where he takes it to be philosophically incoherent. Scotus pays the theological price of denying that the constitution of creatable natures is grounded in God. The philosophical pros and cons of actualism versus possibilism are still debated. By and large, radical orthodoxy fails to understand how Scotus's doctrine of univocity distinguishes the thesis of conceptual univocity from that of common metaphysical constituents. It also confuses the issue of conceptual subordination, the essentially harmless notion of God's falling under the abstract general concept of being, with ontological dependence, the metaphysical absurdity of God's ontologically depending on being in general, and or act potency composition, which Scotus and Aquinas agree is not to be found in God. Partly because of these misconceptions, radical orthodoxy fails to show Scotus's philosophical positions to be theologically disastrous. Thompson's Heidegger, Ontotheology historicized. Fast forwarding from the Middle Ages to the 20th century, we find Heidegger claiming that metaphysics as practiced down through the ages is inherently ontotheological. Since I am not a Heidegger scholar, I follow Ian Thompson's helpful characterization, which allows us to summarize Heidegger's position in 3 moves. First, you can see why that would appeal to an analytic theologian. But I have read Being and Time. First, Heidegger maintains metaphysics is a science of being qua being. Metaphysics divides into 2 familiar parts. On the one hand, metaphysics develops an analysis of what all beings have in common and of the fundamental categories of being. This is ontology. But metaphysics also seeks to know what is the highest and best of beings, or what is the source of beings. This is theology. Second, to this analysis of metaphysics as ontotheology, Heidegger adds a historicist thesis that successful metaphysical analyses set the conceptual frame for an epoch of history, but that history is punctuated by crises in which one metaphysical analysis is replaced by another, which sets the frame for the next epoch. Third, in some of his works, Heidegger invites those gripped by the concept of being to step outside the conceptual framework within which they have been operating and to try to get back to the original self-disclosure of being, to which the successive metaphysical analyses were a response. To get back, whether through an analysis of early Greek poetry and etymologies, or through some sort of phenomenological encounter. According to Thompson's Heidegger, ontotheology is a more or less inevitable as a human response to the world. Heidegger's historicism and invitations to encounter could be seen as balancing calls to humility. However much we engage in metaphysical analysis and work to develop a certain frame of ideas, we should resist the temptation to think that we can thereby master reality or nail down the truth once and for all. Historicism apart, disagreement in philosophy, the very fact that there have been and are very different incommensurate metaphysical analyses, should give us pause, loosen our grip, and invite us to a more open mind. Likewise, we should not mistake analysis for encounter. Indeed, we should let our analysis be interrupted by encounter. Certainly on Thompson's Heidegger's analysis, both Aquinas and Scotus turn out to be ontotheologians. Both analyze the nature of being qua being, what beings have in common just insofar as they are beings, and what the fundamental categories of being are. Both use metaphysical principles to mount cosmological arguments to the ultimate explainer, who is the highest and best. To a remarkable extent, Aquinas and Scotus both agree with much that Thompson's Heidegger says. Both Aquinas and Scotus see discursive reasoning as rooted in human cognitive psychology, in the way that we take in our surround. Yet for both medievals, there's a difference between our ante-mortem science, propositions framed in abstract concepts, arguments, and inferences, and intuitive cognition of what is extant and present before our eyes. Both locate the goal of their search for ultimate reality, not in theoretical analysis, but in beatific vision and enjoyment of the divine essence. Both agree with Heidegger. Ultimate reality is not something we can grasp by our own powers. We must prepare, but we must also be open and wait for it to disclose itself. Ontotheology as prayer. More and more serious charges. Alternative readings of Heidegger find him going further to advocate an end to metaphysics as ontotheology. Bringing the lesson home to theology, critics conclude that all ontotheological frameworks are idolatrous because God outclasses our cognitive psychological capacities. Metaphysics and philosophical theology are inherently blasphemous because they substitute human conceptual frameworks for reality. Often in the background, there is some broadly Kantian picture that God is not the kind of thing that could appear as an object of our experience. Neither can encounters with God, if any, be managed by the conceptual machinery we use to organize our experience of the world here below. On these more radical readings, Heidegger counts ontotheology as pernicious because, in the West, the Kantian epistemic role of organizing the subjective world of our experience has generalized into a culture of technology that regards things in the world as there to be used, managed, and controlled by us. Thus, Merrill Westphal warns, doing metaphysics and philosophical theology stirs up our sinful desires for mastery and domination. The ontotheological project dangles the almost irresistible temptation to think that our conceptual frameworks are exclusively and permanently valid. Ontotheology is bad because it puts God in the service of making the world intelligible to us, and so at our manipulative disposal. Westphal adds, even if we resist the hubris of thinking we have everything conceptually nailed down, our efforts to demystify the world will prove sterile. Humans were created for encounter and worship, but the unproducible producer of ontotheology provokes no singing and dancing, evidently because it is not an appropriate object of worship. Ontotheology in its place. Such ominous accusations seem, however, to judge the activity solely by its abuses. Religion exists to foster human attempts to live in relationship with what vastly outclasses us. Religion acknowledges the obvious. Such relationships have to engage human cognitive and affective capacities. If Westphal et al. Advise us to abandon ontotheological projects, other theologians down through the ages try to respect divine otherness while insisting both that there is a place for ontotheology and that ontotheology can be kept in its place. Metaphor, myth, and multiple ontotheologies. For a contemporary example, take John Hick's theory of religious pluralism. In an interpretation of religion, Hick adopts a broadly Kantian picture, according to which the real in itself is not cognitively accessible to humans. The real is transcategorial, in that it cannot be housed by the conceptual cubbyholes that the human mind invents. Nevertheless, Hick recognizes the human race has responded to encounters with the real in itself by evolving a variety of complex religious practices, practices that eventually include not only authoritative narratives, but also philosophical theology. Thompson's Heidegger allows a given ontotheology full sway for a time and a season, while warning that its epoch will come to an end. Hick counters, the plurality of the world's great religions shows that many competing ontotheologies are in play at the same time. Hick does not conclude that ontotheology is intrinsically pernicious. Instead, he issues twin cautions. First, Hick declares that the transcendence of the real means that no ontotheological statements can be literally true. Ontotheological statements can be at most mythologically or metaphorically true, and that only insofar as they make a positive contribution to the wider religious praxis of producing saints. Second, if ontotheology is fine in its place, what is not all right is insisting that one religion, say Christianity, is superior to others because its ontotheology is literally true, while the others are literally false. The ontotheologies of the world's great religions are all mythologically or metaphorically true, to the extent that the world's great religions are equally successful in fostering growth from self-centeredness to altruism in their devotees. Hick has ontotheology without idolatry by downgrading the semantic status of its assertions as truth-bearers. For an attempt to combine literal truth with appropriate devotion, go back to St. Anselm of Canterbury in the 11th century. According to Anselm, humans were made to love God above all and for God's own sake, and eventually to receive the reward of requited love, which sees and enjoys God forever. Even apart from sin, such union with God exceeds our capacities and is ultimately a gift and a reward. The antemortem human vocation is to strive into God with all our powers. Benedictine monasticism trains the will through disciplined obedience and shapes the emotions through spiritual exercises. Anselm's innovation is to notice that because we don't have very many powers, all of them need to get into the act, the intellect included. Anselm's proslogion illustrates how this works. For Anselm, Pace Westphal, intellectual work is a form of prayer. Its method is questioning and disputing. Anselm presses questions, waits for the aha of disclosure, and then formulates it in words. Questions are addressed to God. Disclosure comes from God, the inner teacher. As the stupid, silly student, Anselm's words, Anselm's part is to raise the questions, articulate the insights, and then to question once again. On his analysis of human cognitive psychology, phenomenological disclosure and articulation go hand in hand. Yet the articulations are never taken as final, and the antemortem disclosures never fully satisfy. For one thing, even if, pace Plotinus, God is not utterly ineffable, God is incomprehensible in the sense that we will never be able fully to grasp who and what God is. Moreover, understanding is a mean between faith and sight. What we really want is face-to-face vision and enjoyment. For the elect, this will be granted only after death. In the meantime, aha disclosures and articulated understanding are the Beater's consolation. Resting on theoretical laurels is contrary to our antemortem vocations. Nor is Anselm especially committed to the idea that striving into God will come to an end post-mortem. On the contrary, Anselm declares, God is not only a being a greater than which cannot be conceived, God is a being greater than can be conceived. Because divine goodness is unfathomable, all of our explanations of why God became human will be superficial. No matter how deep we go into God's reasons, there will always be more. Earlier, Gregory of Nyssa had suggested the proslogian dynamic, with each discovery heightening desire and fueling further seeking, could go on forever. Already Aristotle had envisioned that the analytical work of philosophy would resolve into a happy contemplation of the results. In the 13th century, Bonaventure writes his Itinerarium Mentis in Deum for university friars, who have already worked their way through physics, psychology, and metaphysics. Friars who had already read or heard others read commentaries on Peter Lombard's sentences. Bonaventure's book instructs friars who already have ontotheology under their cinctures how to begin contemplating God in and through the material world, then to turn inward to contemplate God in the essential workings of their own minds, then to turn attention upwards to contemplate God first as being supremely simple and yet within all things, and then as goodness, self-diffusing itself into a trinity of persons. For these university friars, ontotheology was a prolegomena, which gives way to contemplation, which eventually boggles the mind with the realization that triunity is incarnate and crucified. Godhead overwhelms the mind's processing capacities. Burning love for the crucified brings the mind to ecstasy, where love outruns cognition. The mind does not grasp, but is grasped. For Bonaventure, the statements of ontotheology are literally true, and Godhead is infinitely more than we can ask or imagine. Westphal's idea that we cannot sing and dance before the first cause fails to take seriously who the first cause really is. Reread the proslogion and watch how Anselm's ontotheological results provoke rapturous outbursts of thanksgiving, of frustration, and desire. Fides quaerens intellectum. To deploy Anselm's method of correlation, What should keep the one before whom we sing and dance from being the unproduced producer, the first cause of the being and excellence of everything else? Westphal warns, it would be a sin of pride to think our theories had nailed God down. Anselm counters, it would be a sin of sloth not to strive with intellect as well as emotions and will. Westphal charges, ontotheology substitutes theory for praxis. For his part, Anselm never draws the Aristotelian distinction between theoretical and practical science. Anselm insists on the contrary. Ontotheology is a dimension of praxis because ontotheology is a form of prayer. Thank you.
We have time for questions. I will call on people, and when I call on you, I will bring you the microphone, which I hope will stop ringing.
Be careful with this.
Don't stand next to the speaker when you ask your question.
Thank you for that masterful and succinct, just incredibly rich presentation. I just want to ask what I think is a simple question relating to mystical experience of God. Would you say that language should be said to be descriptive of mystical experience, or rather constitutive of mystical experience? Thank you. Sorry, this relates to John Hick, I mean, in a sense, and the whole question of pluralism and the perennialist school, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm just working through some of this stuff right now. I'd love to know your thoughts.
I may well be missing something, but I would have thought that it was supposed to be expressive of it in some way. So, I mean, John Hick doesn't want to say that the statements of ontotheologies are literally true. So then in that sense, you might say, well, if they're not literally true, are they really descriptive? But they're kind of attempting to describe what is beyond our description, right? So for Hick, they're expressing it in language, but he kind of wants to back off in the interpretation of religion from the claim that any of them is fully descriptive. I mean, he uses the words mythologically true or metaphorically true. And that kind of suggests that we're working in the realm of images and analogies. And Anselm and Bonaventure, on the other hand, I think do think that what they say in their theologies is descriptive. But of course, describing God, that's like knowledge by description is not as good as knowledge by acquaintance. But given what human beings are, here, at least here below, I myself, for my own part, would say this probably doesn't go away. Given how we work cognitive psychologically and so forth, that knowledge by acquaintance is something that we respond to by articulation, right? And they think that the articulations they come up with, once they've refined them, are literally true. At least they're purporting to be literally true. They're either literally true or literally false, they want to say, right? I think that Hick agrees that we respond to encounters with the real, whatever those encounters are, by saying things, because human beings are language-using animals, right? Maimonides said. So, but he doesn't want to say that they're literally true, so he might want to back off from the claim it's descriptive. But I think that this dynamic of, I'm really drawn to Anselm's method in the proslogian. Some of you know this, heard this before. But the idea that we would get some kind of encounter or disclosure, and then articulate it, and then question it, examine it, analyze it, and then get form another question and get another aha, you know, that kind of way of taking in what is really beyond us is something that probably I find it hard to believe that wouldn't be permanent, that it wouldn't be last post-mortem. I mean, Bonaventure seems to think that there are certain kinds of encounters with God that just, your mind just shuts down, right? Because it just blows your circuits, right? But then, even with St. Francis, right, he had those experiences. St. Francis is his paradigm. But then he comes back down and preaches, you know. Yeah.
Thanks for a beautiful talk. I just wanted to ask about the possibilism and actualism debate between Scotus and Aquinas.
Yeah.
Partly because maybe I just didn't understand the picture you were giving of Scotus.
Okay.
So maybe, let's say possibilism is the view that somehow what's possible is prior to what's actual, facts about what's possible,
Yeah.
and then the actual world is just selected from among the possible worlds, if you want to talk in that way.
Yeah.
Whereas an actualist thinks that somehow all facts about possibility have to be grounded in what's actual.
Yes.
And I guess I'd always taken it that the kind of Christian Platonist move in many of the figures you're discussing is to put the possible into the realm of divine thought, and to say that, yes, I mean, unless you're a voluntarist of some extreme sort, yes, the structure of possibility, sort of what the natures are and what they're like and what is compossible and all that, is in some sense independent of God's choices or whatever, but the being of possibility depends on, and then I guess there's some debate about whether it's God, what God exemplifies or what God merely thinks and so forth. So someone like Leibniz, who seems to have that view, as you know, is often called an actualist. Mm-hmm. But then I thought, it sounded to me like your description of Scotus's view was something along those lines, the being of possibility located somehow in God's actuality, admitting that the structure of possibility may not be under God's control or something like that. But is that sufficient to make Scotus a possibilist?
I think that the difference between Aquinas and Scotus is not a question of whether the content or constitution of creatable natures is within God's control, the control of God's will. The difference, because the difference is that Aquinas thinks that it's grounded in God's essence, which is not within the control of God's will.
Okay.
So what it is to be a cow is at bottom a bovine way of imperfectly imitating the divine essence, right?
Okay.
Okay. So it's grounded in something actual because ipsum esse is pure actuality, right?
Right.
Okay. But it's not within. God couldn't have made cows fly or something like
Right.
natural flyers. I mean, or something like that. The constitution of what it is to be a cow isn't something that God can mess with, right?
Right, and that's for Aquinas.
But that's
okay.
because God can't mess with his own essence.
Right, okay.
Right. Okay. For Scotus starts with, I mean, this would be one way to put it. Maybe some people would disagree with, the Scotus interpreters would disagree with me, but I think that the easiest way into Scotus's ontology is to say, well, start with the realm of natures, or properties, right? Start with the realm of properties. And then, and the properties that considered as possibilia, right?
Okay.
And then the properties will have certain kinds of repugnance or non-repugnance relations of themselves. Whether or not they're ever real, whether or not they're ever thought of, pertains to them of themselves to have these relations. Then he tries to say, well, notice about some of these natures that it's essential to them that to exist they have to be caused by something else, right?
Okay.
And then he gives his cosmological argument that, well, if there are natures, this is just in the realm of possibilia, right? If there are natures that couldn't exist without being caused by something else, then there's some nature that is not externally producible, is by its very essence not producible by anything of another nature, and independently productive. That is to say, not dependent on anything else for exercising its causality. So there's some nature like that. And then he argues, well, that nature has got to be real. Now you can quarrel with these arguments, but the point is, it's fair enough to say he's starting with a realm of natures, and then he's starting with the realm of natures, and then he's getting from that to the actual, right? And he does that. That's his strategy for getting a demonstration, because premises about the natures of themselves are necessary premises, and that's what real demonstrations take, he says. Okay.
I see. Okay.
But he does not think, so he's a possibilist in that sense, and he does not think that the constitution of creatable natures is grounded in imitability relations, because he thinks that a relation presupposes both relata. So it's prior in the order of explanation that bovinity is whatever it is, and God is, divine essence is whatever it is, and hey, look, this is imperfectly similar to that. But what it is to be a cow is not constituted by some kind of relation. So I think that in that sense, there's something to the claim, but I don't really see what's theologically disastrous about it. I mean,
somehow putting this prior realm of possible natures and their repugnance relations and so forth prior to what God can do, I guess, is supposed to be problematic.
well, it's a cost, but on the other hand, you get philosophical coherence as a benefit. I mean, that's the way he's seeing it. I mean, now one could disagree with that, but I mean, I think in this case, drawn as I am, I mean, I love Plato and all that, but, at bottom, it's hard to believe that at bottom we're just relations,
Keep your hands up for a second, I'll get a mental cue.
Yeah, thank you very much for the lecture. I have a question about your reading of Anselm of Canterbury.
Oh, yeah?
You use the phrase ontotheology as a form of prayer. And I'm wondering if that is an overstatement. And maybe a better term, or as I would understand it, ontotheology or theology in the context of prayer. So it's theological reflection in the context of faith, or in the horizon of faith, if I may use this word horizon from the hermeneutical tradition. So, but ontotheology as a form of prayer, which also means an as prayer, seems to me, I'm not sure, I'm not yet convinced. Maybe you can explain this a bit.
Well, I don't know if I can explain it, but textually what convinced me was that most of the questions that he raises are addressed to God explicitly. Not every single one, but the vast majority are addressed to God. So I take that to be like he's having a conversation with God here. He's saying, well, but how can you be merciful when you are unchangeable? Because to be merciful is to get all torn up to have bowels of compassion, and you don't have any bowels, so how could you be merciful, right? And then, he goes on about this for a while, and then he says, but maybe when we say you're merciful, what we mean is that you're the kind, you cause effects of the kind that a merciful being would cause, or something like that, right? So he keeps addressing the questions to God, and that's what makes me say that it's kind of prayer. And I have to say, I really, this is what reconciled me to being a philosopher, actually. Because I used to struggle with why shouldn't I become a social worker and go out and do something useful and so forth, and how can I integrate faith and philosophy and so on. And then I studied Anselm, and I thought, that's the answer. Philosophy, theology is a form of prayer. And so I thought, okay, I can live with that. So I might be wrong. I may be holding on to this, but textually what convinces me is that the vast majority of questions are addressed to God in the proslogion, which I think is his most methodologically explicit piece. And here's another thing. There's a kind of dynamic that if you look at the opening and closing prayers and his prayers that are composed, I mean, the book of prayers, the collection of prayers that we have come down to us, and they have a certain kind of prayer dynamic, right? And if you look at not just the proslogion, but even the Cur Deus Homo, you can find the spiritual dynamics of prayer traced out in the Cur Deus. So that's my textual evidence.
Thank you for a really lovely, I'm over here. Over here. Hi. For a really lovely and engaging talk. I've had this quote from Albert the Great on my phone for a couple months that I've been kind of grappling with. And so I wanted to read it, and I'd just like to hear what you can say about it in relation to what you said, especially about ontotheology as a form of prayer, as a praxis, and also in particular with its relation to the religious emotions of awe and wonder, and kind of this claim that perhaps one needs to go beyond ontotheology in order to experience certain religious emotions. So here's the quote. He says, the philosopher contemplates God insofar as he takes him in some kind of demonstrative conclusion, but the theologian contemplates him as he exists beyond reason and understanding. The theologian depends upon the first truth for its own sake, not because of reason, though he has reason too. Hence, the theologian remains in awe, but not the philosopher. And I'd just like to hear what you wanted to say kind of in relation to what you have said about ontotheology today.
Well, it sounds like he might be against it in some way, right? Goodness gracious. See, what came to mind as you started was the quote that from Aristotle, philosophy begins in wonder and ends in awe. And I think, amen. And if Albert didn't see that after all that compiling of philosophical arguments, I'm sorry. Now, of course, the thing is that we'll be even more awestruck by the reality of Godhead. And I think that the people that the examples that I brought forward would agree to that, right? And so nobody wants to say, well, just do philosophy and don't worry about that religion stuff, right? It's enough just to grind out your theorems or whatever. That's not what they're saying. But they're saying that it has a role, at least a role for some people in the spiritual path. But Albert, I guess, doesn't want to go there. I don't think Aquinas would really have agreed with him. I mean, he does end up saying it's all straw, but that's kind of like saying, well, you know, God is infinitely more than we can ask or imagine or something.
I particularly like the way that you showed the tension with Augustine between God as being beyond being and the God of the Bible. Now, I think there's also pressure, however, between the God of the Bible and God as being. And I'm wondering if you sense that. I mean, I think Austin Farrer felt that very deeply in his shift from a Thomistic position to a different position. Because how are you going to pray to being with a capital B? What is activity, the whole raft of activity of God, which is so central to the Christian and Jewish tradition? How are you going to predicate that of something called being with a capital B? So isn't there equally pressure to sort of rethink God as being from the same source that leads one to be worried about God as being beyond being?
Well, that's a good question, of course. And I think there might be several questions there, right? So, I mean, Anselm's method is a kind of method of correlation, right? So he'll give you some proofs, because like in the Monologion, he's trying to prove sola ratione, right, by reason alone. So he gives you a bunch of philosophical proofs. And then he shifts over to using some religious language. And you think, oh, is he cheating here, you know? But no, I think that what he's doing is he'll start talking about the word, you know, and you think, oh, well, you know. But actually what he's trying to say is, hey, you know, look, what we just proved the existence of, that's what we talk about in theology, in church, or that's what the Bible's talking about when it says the Word became flesh, and, you know, in the beginning, God spoke the Word and created, and so on. And so there's an effort to see a correlation, to kind of correlate biblical ways of speaking with the metaphysical scheme. And so once you have the correlation in place, then you don't have to pray to being itself, right? You can pray to our Father who art in heaven or whatever, right? And it's okay, because you've just figured out that basically that's who being itself is. So that's one line of answer. But you might be asking a further question, which is, well, you know, the metaphysics of these people that I cited is not as friendly to biblical religion as one might like, because it posits the ultimate explainer to be immutable, and that doesn't, and impassible, and so on, and that doesn't look like a plain sense reading of the Bible, you know, and so that's a tough one, right? And of course, there's a whole history of trying to work with that, but and one might wish to abandon the metaphysical systems of the medievals. I certainly don't take them over lock, stock, and barrel either. But it's one thing to abandon a particular metaphysical approach, and it's another to say, ontotheology is bad, we should quit doing that, and sing and dance. And I think, I sing and dance. But, you know, I also get a kick out of the fact that, you know, I read these theological treatises about what I'm singing and dancing about. So I know my taste is peculiar, but not unique.
After this next question, I have two more people in the queue. If you want to get in the queue, just catch my eye. We're going to go until, I mean, I don't know how many we'll get to, we're cutting it off at 4:30, but in case you're wondering how to get in the queue, just catch my eye.
Hi, over here. Thank you so much for your talk. My question was, or I was wanting to get your comments on the significance of negative theology or apophatic reasoning in these thinkers and the role it plays in either establishing a gap or closing the gap in analogic talk or thinking.
Okay, so there is a tradition in Judaism and Christianity of apophatic theology, and they might, to a certain extent, be favorable to the criticism that ontotheology is an error because God is beyond whatever. I think not all apophatic theologies are like that. I mean, if you think of Maimonides, for example, there's cosmological arguments in Maimonides. It's just that the top of the line is, it can't be described in terms of positive predicates because the ultimate explainer is simple, and Maimonides' understanding of semantics and simplicity is such that you can't predicate any positive properties thereof, right? So it's not clear that, it's not that that apophatic theology is necessarily not philosophical theology, but what apophatic theology might do that people like Milbank might like better is say that the ultimate source is not something that you can give a positive description of or something like that, right? And so it seems to accommodate the desire not to be idolatrous in spades, right? It really accommodates that well. But then it's got to explain away the personal, the religious practice that takes God to be personal. Now, Maimonides does explain it away, you know. And the Bhagavad Gita also explains it away, and it's in Hinduism, right? But so it's a genuine theological choice, right? And you have to decide whether you think avoiding, you want to stay so far away from idolatry that it's best to have a negative theology, or something even more radical. I think Mario has lately said he doesn't want negative theology, he wants, I don't know, but anyway. And saying, no, the personal is really, if you want to know what's distinctive about biblical religion, it's that God is personal, and a person who creates other persons and has social projects with other persons and relates to them persons to person and so forth. And that what's really distinctive about biblical religion is that personality is the heart of reality. And that's what's distinctive. And if you think that, then you've got to do something to try to say, well, but don't think he's just like us, right? Not just Jack and the Beanstalk, a giant version of us. God has to be somehow more metaphysically distinctive than that. But so you have the problem of trying to give some kind of balance.
Hi. I wanted to ask a question about the concept of metaphorical truth that you're taking from Hick. So, this is clearly a foreign claim to your medieval authors. They'll take metaphor to be a kind of literal truth.
It's foreign to what?
The medieval authors, for Aquinas and Scotus and Anselm, where literal statements and metaphors, so metaphor is a kind of literal truth. So in the Bible, metaphors make literal claims about historical events, say. Anyway, what I wanted to ask was whether, I can see how this is working in Anselm, who you got to after Hick. For instance, say in Anselm's, where he has a prayer to God as mother, and he talks about the sort of human context of prayer. But I wanted to ask about Aquinas and Scotus, and whether taking ontotheology as metaphorical truth will have a sort of disintegrating effect on ontotheology as a science. Because metaphorical truth isn't the same kind of truth as the other Aristotelian sciences. And for Aquinas and Scotus, there's, as you were talking about, the sort of essential connection between this hierarchy of sciences. So is reading ontotheology in a metaphorical lens going to sort of disintegrate that project?
Aquinas and Scotus will not want to say that ontotheology is only metaphorically true. They're not going to want that. My recollection is that when Aquinas talks about metaphor, he thinks like God is a lion, or the Lion of Judah is the lamb that was slain, that's metaphorical, right? It's not literal, it's metaphorical, it's an image. You can translate it into something literal, or you can say that it implies something that you could say was literally true, but it in itself is a metaphorical claim. So when Hick, in a sense, it seems to me that, Hick starts out as a philosopher of religion, as a philosophical theologian, and as he moves into the religious pluralism world, he sees the benefit of attempts in Hinduism and the biblical religions to try to give clear articulations of things he can see are used for that. He sees, that's what he spent his life doing, for that matter, right? But he doesn't want to. He doesn't want to give it. He doesn't want to have conflicting truth claims, because he doesn't want to say literal truth, because he thinks that the belief that ontotheological claims are literally true is a salient cause in religious violence. I think that's probably not true, but I never could persuade him of that. I think people are violent. There's tribalism, and you'll just take whatever badge is handy as an excuse to have an us-them categorization. But anyway, he was very convinced that, believing that the incarnation, that that God literally was hypostatically united to a human nature had caused a lot of religious violence in the world, and that therefore one should say it's a metaphor. So that's not very satisfying. But Scotus and Aquinas would not be interested in that whatsoever, and I wouldn't be interested either. I mean, I guess I would want to say, look, if I thought it couldn't be literally true, then I'd give up on it. You know, there are stories. You know, you can go with stories, but I either want it to be true or not do it. But that's just my bias.
Next question's over here.
Hi, thank you for a very thought-provoking, wide-ranging, I guess as far wide-ranging as you can present in 45 minutes or so. But my question was about the Heidegger reading, and I guess Thompson.
Maybe you can tell me what he really thinks.
Well, I guess I wanted to push back just a little bit. I think Thompson's reading is really good.
It's the clearest thing I have read.
But I wonder if it might turn out that you might share something in common that you might not have expected to share in common with Heidegger. Because the worry, it doesn't seem to me that the worry, the primary essay where Heidegger lays out his critique of ontotheology is, of course, identity and difference. And the primary worry, or his primary, the person he's going after in that essay is Hegel. And it seems to me that the critique, it probably involves a lot of things and can't be quickly summarized, but it seems to me at least part of what his worry is rationally grounding the divine, so that the divine only is insofar as the divine can be rationally grounded somehow in human reason. And his worry seems to be much more people like Descartes, Leibniz, Hegel, the causa sui, God is causa sui, and his worry with the God is causa sui, I don't think is so much the logic behind God as first cause, but this notion that God can somehow be grounded and have God's foundation in human reason. And if that's right, if that's a fair way to characterize at least one of Heidegger's worry, that is grounding God in human reason, is that a worry that you might share in common with Heidegger?
I guess I wonder what you mean by grounding God in human reason. If you mean giving an argument which has its conclusion that God exists and is triune and incarnate or whatever it might be.
No, not just simply giving an argument, but the sense that God only is insofar as God can be grounded in human reason.
But does that mean that?
I
wouldn't agree with that because I think God could exist.
The idea is that God isn't if you can't give a human reason for God.
No, I don't buy that at all. No,
yeah,
I mean,
and that's the worry. That's the worry
so
that Heidegger
my
has.
thought would be rather that God could have existed all by God's self in the world, and God freely and contingently chose to make other stuff, which includes us, remarkably enough. So I guess I don't buy that, right? But do I think that reason can know something about God or prove that God exists or at least give some kinds of arguments? Well, I think that we can at least analyze the concept of God, and we can say quite a bit. We can give philosophical formulations of theological ideas. I haven't plopped down for which argument for the existence of God or package that I would get behind, but I guess I think it's reasonable to believe in God. So I think all those things, but I think that God's existence doesn't depend on any of us thinking so. No.
We have many people still in the queue, but about 2 minutes left. So the last question goes to Myron, who will make it concise.
And that's an order.
And I'm a rule follower, so I will make it concise. Do you think that Hick's own model escapes making ontotheological claims that he needs to be literally true, not just mythologically true, insofar as he says altruism, for example, orients one toward transcendent reality? That, to me, strikes me as an ontotheological claim that he is committed to thinking is literally true.
Yes, I think he does think that's literally true, and I think he also thinks it's that there is a real behind all of our conceptualizations. I think he thinks that's true too. So it's not as if he doesn't have some kind of basic philosophical framework claims that he's committed to. It's a little bit hard to figure out exactly what they are, because it's broadly Kantian. Well, broadly, you know. Not that I understand Kantian, but there are people here who do. Yeah.
All right, those who did not get to ask their questions, maybe you can take them up at the reception, and everybody else, please join us there too. It's in the Homeland Room, and for now, let's thank Marilyn.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for your questions.
Bravo!
Basta.